All right, everybody, this is a really special book for book number 100. This is the first book Grandma ever was given 60 years ago. It's called The Chosen Baby by Valentina P. Wasson. This is a special book because it's sort of Grandma's story and Uncle Brad's story and Gwen's two cousins, Eliza and Mary, both have this story. They're chosen babies, just like Grandma and Uncle Brad. The Chosen Baby. And this is to Beth Marie, happiness always, Mary Margaret Ellisy. Mary Margaret was the lady who great grandma and great grandpa adopt Grandma and Uncle Brad. They weren't able to have children of their own, so we became their children. And this is their story too. The Chosen Baby. By Valentina P. Wasson, illustrated by Hildegard Woodward. And I like that little drawing of the baby there. The Chosen Baby. Once upon a time in a large city, there lived Mr. and Mrs. Brown. They had been married for many years. They had been as happy as can be and were still young, and only one thing was wrong. They had no babies of their own, although they always longed for a baby to share their home. One day, Mr. and Mrs. Brown said to each other, "Let's adopt a baby and bring him up as our own." So the next day, they called up the lady who helps people to adopt babies and babies to adopt parents and said to her, "Mrs. White, we wish so much to find a baby who would like to have a mother and father and who could be our very own. Will you help us find one?" Mrs. White said, "It's not too easy. Many people wish to adopt babies and you have to wait a long time. But come and see me and let's talk it over." So Mr. and Mrs. Brown went to see Mrs. White and told them how much they wanted to adopt a baby. Mrs. White asked them whether they wanted a baby boy or a baby girl. Mr. and Mrs. Brown answered, "It really does not matter, but we think we should like our first chosen baby to be a boy. But if you find a baby girl for us, we'll be just as happy." Mrs. White asked them many questions. "I'll do my best to find just the right baby for you, but remember, you may have to wait a long time." After a little while, Mrs. White came to visit Mr. Brown. They were very particular. She asked more questions and went all over their home. She seemed especially interested in knowing where the chosen baby would sleep and play. She found that Mr. and Mrs. Brown had a clean and lovely home. Many months went by, and Mr. and Mrs. Brown kept saying to each other, "I wonder when our baby will be coming." And Mrs. Brown would call up Mrs. White and say, "We're still waiting for our baby. Please don't forget about us." And she was told to be patient because their baby would be coming someday. Several weeks later, Mrs. White came to visit Mr. and Mrs. Brown again. It was a happy time. Mr. and Mrs. Brown kept saying to themselves, "Surely this means our baby is coming soon." They told Mrs. White that if the chosen baby turned out to be a boy, they would call his name Peter. But if it was a girl, her name would be Mary. One day, suddenly the telephone bell rang and it was Mrs. White, and she said, "I have good news for you. We have a baby boy for you to see. Can you come tomorrow?" So the very next morning, Mr. and Mrs. Brown hurried to Mrs. White's office. First, Mrs. White told them all about the baby boy, and then she said, "Now go into the next room and see the baby. If you find that he is not just the right baby for you, tell me so, and we'll try and find another." And there in the next room, asleep in a crib, lay a rosy, fat baby boy. He opened his big brown eyes and smiled. Mrs. Brown picked him up and sat him on her lap and said, "This is our chosen baby. We don't need to look any farther. We'll have everything ready for him by tomorrow, and we'll take him home then." Mr. Brown felt the same way, and they were both happy that tomorrow they would have their very own baby boy. The baby was laughing and kicking his legs and wiggling all his toes. So that same day, the Browns went to a shop and bought a carriage and bottles and all the clothes and things that babies need. They could hardly wait for the next day to come. Bright and early the next morning, Mr. and Mrs. Brown went to fetch the baby, and they brought him home. Mrs. Brown fed him cereal, milk, and orange juice and put him in his crib. Then Mr. and Mrs. Brown stood for a long time smiling at their baby. Soon he was fast asleep. And so they called his name Peter. After a few days, Peter's new grandfathers and grandmothers, uncles and aunts and cousins came to see him, and they all agreed he was a lovely baby. His parents thought so too. Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Peter had wonderful times together and laughed and played, and they were ever so happy. Peter grew up fast and so well that soon he began to crawl and to walk and to climb and to talk, and he loved to play hide and seek, hiding behind the doors and beds, and no one could find him, but he could always find his daddy. Every week he would visit his grandfather and grandmother who lived in the same city, and they always gave him cookies and milk. When summer came, Peter went on a long trip to the seaside and paid a visit to his other grandfather and grandmother. He played in the sand with his pail and shovel. The waves and Peter chased each other up and down the beach and kept laughing at each other. These grandparents also thought Peter a fine boy, and they liked to watch Peter as he splashed in the ocean. One day, Mrs. Brown was taking Peter in his stroller to the park in the city when a little girl came running by with a hoop and a whoop, and Peter wanted to run and play with her. She was a pretty girl with red hair and freckles. When Mrs. Brown reached home, she went straight to Mr. Brown and said, "Peter and I saw a little girl today. We both think that we should adopt a baby sister, and then she and Peter can play together." Mr. Brown thought this was a wonderful idea. So the next day, Mrs. Brown called up Mrs. White and said, "We wish to find a baby sister for Peter." And Mrs. White said, "We shall gladly try and find a sister for Peter, but you may have to wait a long time. More and more people wish to adopt babies." Peter was so excited about getting a baby sister, he could hardly wait for the day when she would come. He was now big enough to sleep in a real bed, and he told his mother he would give his crib to his sister. But almost a year went by, and Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Peter were becoming impatient. One day, Mrs. White called on the telephone. "I have a baby girl here who I think would be a good sister for Peter. Can you come see her tomorrow?" So the Browns went the next day and found waiting for them a tiny baby girl with soft brown eyes and a happy smile. Mrs. Brown said, "We love this baby already." The baby was holding one of Mr. Brown's fingers tight in her fist. They did not take the baby home on that day because they wanted Peter to see her too. On the next day, Peter came and saw the baby. He thought it was the best baby girl he'd ever seen. He wanted her for his sister. So Peter and Mrs. Brown took the baby home. When Peter woke up the next day, he ran right to his old crib, and there he found his baby sister sleeping. Then he ran to his mother and said, "Mommy, Mommy, come and see Peter's baby." Mr. and Mrs. Brown remembered that long ago they had decided that the name of their little girl would be Mary. They asked Peter, and he said it was a fine name, so they called the baby Mary. They gave a big party with ice cream and cake and lots of candy, and grandfathers and grandmothers and cousins and aunts and uncles came, and they all thought Mary was a wonderful baby. Peter showed everybody that he could almost stand on his head. Peter had learned many things about babies. He shared his room and his toys with his sister, and now that he was a big boy, he could ride his bike to the park, and he let Mary have his old stroller. Mary grew fast and is now a lovely little girl with curly hair who runs about and began to talk. Peter and Mary liked to hear the story of how they were adopted, and Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Mary and Peter are a very happy family. The chosen baby. Grandma remembers when we got to go get Uncle Brad. We went to a special place, and Grandma was riding around on a tricycle downstairs. And then a lady came in holding a baby, and I knew it was going to be our baby. And I grabbed her hand and pulled her into the room where my mommy and daddy were and said, "She has our baby." And we looked, and now that was our Uncle Brad for you all, my baby brother Brad, who was so much taller than I am, but he's still the younger brother. The chosen baby.